Welcome. My name is Ambika Bum. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense. We at the Commission would like to wholeheartedly welcome you to this momentous event where we are both honoring Senator Lieberman and his impact on biodefense and releasing the National Blueprint for Biodefense, which was written under his stewardship. To commence this program, I'd like to introduce two statesmen who have led our nation fearlessly. After serving in Congress for over a decade, being the inaugural Secretary of Homeland Security and Governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Ridge has co-chaired this commission since it was formed 10 years ago. Senator Tom Daschle served in Congress for more than 2 decades and was a Senate Majority Leader, and he also has been with the commission since 2014. Please join me in welcoming both of them.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Commission, we thank you all for joining us today. We certainly appreciate your support and your interest in the Commission and our work, and are grateful you're joining us. I know you're here, hopefully, to better understand the next stage of our work to defend the nation from biological threats. This iteration of the blueprint represents the culmination of our efforts over the past decade, provided with a strong leadership, vision, and energy of our friend, my good friend and Commission co-chair, Senator Joe Lieberman. At this point, I must tell you a quick anecdote about the Senator, because we're so proud that it's a bipartisan commission. I remember when the Senator called me and asked me if I would work with him, I considered it especially a high honor to be approached by Senator Lieberman to work by his side on such an important venture. I was reminded at that moment it was not his first effort to support a bipartisan approach toward problem solving. It reminded me, frankly, of a breakfast I had had with him several years prior with my good friend John McCain. There we were, Senator Lieberman, previously a nominee of the Democratic Party national ticket, having breakfast with another great American patriot, John McCain, the day before Senator McCain announced his candidacy for President of the United States. I said, what a great vision. Talk about bipartisan, talk about friendship, talk about collaboration, talk about the way democracy is supposed to work. That's one of the reasons I think this commission has been so successful. We have strong advocates, people from both sides of the political aisle, all committed to dealing with the potential threat of bioterrorism. You know, I had the distinct honor of working with Senator Lieberman for more than 2 decades on what became known as the Department of Homeland Security. Senator Daschle, I don't know if they offered the job to anybody else. Trust me, I don't know. We shared common cause in the days and the weeks after the attacks on September 11, 2001. In the years since, I think Senator Lieberman, again, working with, I think, his colleague, Senator Collins, Republican side of the aisle, worked very hard and tirelessly to pull together the Department of Homeland Security. In the years since, Senator Lieberman has been there for me for many, on many occasions, just as he is there for so many of you on multiple occasions as well. Excuse me. Oh, thank you. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not scotch and soda. It's not. It's water.
Looks like a Coors Light.
There's not Coors Light either. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Senator. Another bipartisan effort. There we go. How about that? Senator Lieberman has been there for me on many occasions since I was served in public service. He was there in 2003, sitting on the dais during my Senate confirmation hearing to become the first Secretary of Homeland Security. He was there again 11 years later to help me build something more and vitally important to national security, this commission, and to produce our foundational report, A National Blueprint for Biodefense. At the beginning of this venture, we were not sure where our efforts would lead. All we know at the time was that we wanted to help defend this nation against biological threats. After decision makers not only read our blueprint in 2015, but took action to implement parts of it as well, we realized that our efforts were obviously onto something. I still remember meeting with the senator in 2016 to discuss what we wanted to do next with the commission, or if we should even continue. We agreed that improving national biodefense was too great a thing to be left undone. We still had more work to do. And he was willing to embrace that whole notion and put full energy into it as well. Joe and I recognized the call to service these organizations answer every day, and we responded. But to be frank, that decision was made a lot easier because I knew I'd be taking the challenge on with Senator Lieberman at my side. Today is a day to celebrate not just the senator's life, but also his dedication to national security in general and biodefense in particular. Joe's dedication came from a place of love. His love for his family, his friends, his colleagues, his country, and his world. He was so much a man of the world. And his desire to keep that which he loved safe. As we know now, even illness did not hinder his call to service. It went on in spite of his illness. He never wavered in his drive, his energy, his enthusiasm, and his engagement with this cause or any other cause he was committed to. He was a compassionate man who would understand how poorly we feel at his loss. But he would also tell us to stay in the fight and get the work done. I think that's the best thing we can do to honor his memory. In the battle against potential biological threats, we must fight on. And unfortunately, we'll not be able to continue that battle with us at our side. We will miss you, Senator Lieberman. We're grateful for all you've done for this country and, frankly, for the world. And we thank you for your friendship and your leadership. I want to thank all of you again for joining us today to remember Joe's life, legacy, and his work with our commission. Now I'd like to offer former Senator and Majority Leader Tom Daschle the opportunity to make some remarks as well. Tom?
Well, Tom, thank you very much for that introduction. And I have an announcement to make. Before the program began, Governor Ridge and I exchanged speeches. You just heard mine, and I forgot what he was going to say. You can't say it any more eloquently than you've just heard. I had the good fortune to serve in the United States Senate with Joe for many years. He came just 2 years after I did in 1989. My fondest memories come around those times when we had the greatest challenge. I was the majority leader after 9/11 and during the anthrax attack just a month later. And there was no one in the Senate more responsive, more determined, more cooperative, more visionary about what this country needed to do and how it needed to do it than Joe Lieberman. He was the chairman of the Government Affairs Committee and, as Tom said, worked with Susan Collins and offered every ounce of energy and every ounce of imagination in coming up with the response that our country needed to devise as we addressed this challenge. The anthrax attack, if you recall, was in my office, but it wasn't long when we learned it was in Joe's office too. And it was in so many other offices all through the Hart building. We had to evacuate the building. Never done before, and for 3 months. We all had to find someone else to turn to find office space for our offices. And remarkably, it was probably the single most compelling demonstration of bipartisanship I've seen in my public life. Republicans helping Democrats, Democrats helping Republicans to get through this crisis. Joe and I had a common view about bipartisanship. We used to say once in a while that our feeling was compromise is the oxygen of democracy. And there was no one who better understood the importance of compromise and how much oxygen it provided our democracy each and every time we achieved it. And so, when I had the opportunity, when he called, as he did with Governor Ridge, to consider a commission to deal with the enormous challenge our country faces in biological threat today, whether it's man-made or natural, he said, Tom, we're putting this commission together and I'd love to have you part of it. It took me about 30 seconds to say yes, especially when he told me that Governor Ridge was going to be the co-chair. And I can say with complete confidence that I speak for everybody on the commission and those who were on the commission, like Ken Weinstein, who's here somewhere and was on the commission before, that I've worked with a lot of chairs. I've never worked with two chairs more committed to bipartisanship, more committed to civility, more committed to finding partnership in our effort than Tom Ridge and Joe Lieberman. And so as we celebrate his life and dedicate this report to Joe, we just say thank you for inspiring us, for bringing us together, and for doing all he did to make sure this country is prepared for the next one. Thank you very much.
I don't have to read this, Senator, to tell you those were magnificent words from the heart about a great friend of ours. So thank you very much for your words. I'd like to think that everyone in this room had a special relationship and admiration for Joe. And you cherish the love and respect he showed us and the nation he cared so much for. Our commission will continue to honor his memory and dedication to the cause of biodefense. We released the first national blueprint for biodefense about 9 years ago. Since then, we have witnessed several biological events that exploited vulnerabilities in our nation's biodefense. Today, we are excited to release our new national blueprint for biodefense. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't miss words in this report, not that we ever do. We state clearly that biological threats are growing, and we describe exactly what we think needs to be done to keep our nation safe from biological weapons, bioterrorism, lab accidents, and diseases that affect potentially our national security. We are confident this blueprint will serve as a valuable guide for our nation's biodefense efforts, and hopefully will be embraced, if not in all, or at least in part, by our leaders in this town. Senator Daschle, do you have any further thoughts about the 2024 National Blueprint for Biodefense? You come on up here, we can sing in harmony. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Governor Ridge. In the 10 years that have passed since we formed the commission, millions of Americans, and actually people all over the world, have died as a result of a catastrophic pandemic. Economies and world travel were shut down. And COVID-19 reminded us of how vulnerable we all are, no matter where we live. The first national blueprint for biodefense, released by the Commission on October of 2015, may have seemed theoretical and alarmist at the time, but it was painfully real. Since then, the biological threat has not abated. In fact, the threat has intensified. Millions are now waging wars, and we're seeing conflict in Europe, the Middle East, involving countries known to be developing biological weapons. These conflicts raise the threat of biological warfare, which could result in many casualties, much illness, and great suffering. All biological threats hold the power to devastate our way of life. The question remains not if, but when we will confront another biological event. That's why we're here today, to release the 2024 National Blueprint for Biodefense. In the wake of COVID-19 and today's global unrest, there is nothing theoretical about the need to implement the 36 recommendations presented in this report. Each of these recommendations resulted from an exhaustive review of the gaps in current federal policies and procedures, gaps that leave us all unnecessarily vulnerable to biological incidents. In this report, we state clearly that the White House needs to lead the national biodefense enterprise. And for its part, Congress needs to codify the role of the National Security Advisor as the leader of our national biodefense. Congress should also establish a Deputy National Security Advisor to perform the day-to-day duties and responsibilities of national biodefense and the global health security. This is the bottom line. 15 federal departments, 9 independent agencies, and 1 independent institution currently have biodefense responsibilities. One federal department cannot tell other departments and agencies what to do. Only the White House has that authority. This recommendation addresses that problem. This report also calls for a quadrennial biodefense review that would culminate in an updated biodefense strategy and implementation plan submitted to Congress by the White House. Biological threats change. Technology changes. Our biodefense must also change. It is critical that the federal government engage in both biodefense policy and technology development to permanently eliminate the biological threat to our nation and to the world. We learned a great deal during the nation's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and identified measures that we need to take in the future to prevent mass suffering. High up on this list is the need to reduce pathogen transmission indoors. Built environments, such as offices, healthcare facilities, schools, and airplanes, allow for easier transmission of dangerous pathogens. And while the United States exerts significant effort to engineer and defend such indoor environments, such as fires and earthquakes and floods, far less effort is put into engineering and protecting indoor environments against pathogens. That gap likely resulted in significant loss of life during the COVID-19 pandemic. Accordingly, this report recommends that the Congress amend the Public Health Services Act to produce a research and development plan for reducing pathogen transmission in built environments. Another gap addressed by this report is our insufficient investment in medical countermeasure development. Each time a biological crisis occurs, Congress eventually appropriates emergency supplemental funding to enable the rapid development of drugs and vaccines and to shore up our country's declining public health infrastructure. Unfortunately, the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic made the devastating impact of this strategy clear. Emergency funding only came after 2 months of disagreement between Congress and the White House about precise needs and funding levels. Moreover, failure to follow this funding with sustainable annual appropriations threatens to undo much of the progress that we made during the pandemic. That is why we have to prioritize, fund, incentivize, and align investments in medical countermeasures before the next pandemic, accident, or attack occurs. We understand that our recommendations are comprehensive, and they're numerous. We know that the U.S. government will not be able to implement all of them at once, although we'd like that to be the case. But we also know that if our country adopted everything in this report, our people would be well protected from the next biological attack or naturally occurring pandemic, just as our people would have been during the COVID-19 pandemic had the United States implemented all of our recommendations from our 2015 blueprint on biodefense. The recommendations in this report are not just words on pages. They comprise a call for immediate action. I'd like to now invite our colleague, Dr. Raj Panjabi, to lead a panel on the blueprint in biodefense. Dr. Panjabi, as many of you know, served as Special Assistant to President Biden and Senior Director for Global Health Security and Biodefense at the White House National Security Council. Last year, he joined our commission as an ex officio, and we have benefited greatly from his experience and all that he has brought since he's joined us. We look forward to the discussion. Dr. Panjabi.
Well, thank you, Senator Daschle. And I do want to point out, if you haven't noticed, in the spirit of bipartisanship, that we've also coordinated shoes amongst some of us on different sides of the aisle. I want to thank Governor Ridge and Senator Daschle for your very moving comments, both about our late friend Senator Lieberman and your urgent call to action around the recommendations in this report. So other than having finished my tour of duty at the White House in the fall, my wife, who's a psychologist, likes to think of me now as a recovering public servant. I can look back on the time in office with some perspective, and I can honestly say, having kept some of these reports in my office over the years, that the Bipartisan Commission has played such an essential role in helping make our country safer in the face of pandemic and biological threats. You've heard how the Commission, in prior reports, has shaped and informed congressional action. It also helped inspire President Biden's 2022 National Biodefense Strategy and Plan, against which in the year 2022, some $12 billion was invested across 16 federal agencies, according to OMB. And today we want to get into a discussion with the incredible colleagues we have here in the Commission, share their wisdom. And I want to frame up just with a few points first. A year ago this week, the federal government declared an end to COVID-19 as a public health emergency. But the work to prepare ourselves and to make ourselves safer against all form of biological threats, as you've already heard, is not over. It would be a big mistake, in fact, to think that the next pandemic would be in 100 years. In fact, all the evidence shows the biological threat, whether it's from pandemics or other causes, is growing, it's not shrinking. Let me just point out a couple of areas where that is apparent. The threat of deadly outbreaks is growing. We have pathogen spillover from animals to humans, population movement from one city to another, and public health gaps. Forgive my alliteration with the 3 Ps, it's the only way I could remember things in medical school. Those are driving the risk of new outbreaks around the world. And today, we know just in this country, we have multiple farms, whether it's poultry or dairy, in multiple states that are experiencing the largest bird flu outbreak this country has experienced, which is only a warning shot that we need to increase our readiness for potential pandemic flu. The second area of concern is around accidental laboratory releases. In its declassified intelligence report in June 2023, the intel community in the United States said it was plausible that both hypotheses around the origins of COVID, were naturally occurring and laboratory, were both still being assessed. Neither had been ruled out. And finally, the threat of biological attacks is growing. Advances in the ability to study viruses and create vaccines, driven in part by machine learning and artificial intelligence, may help save us. But if our adversaries use the same tools against us, it could also lead to the creation or the acceleration of biological weapons that could actually harm us. So it's in the light of these growing threats that the Commission is deeply focused on the work of how we can keep our country and the world safer. And so over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to discuss these issues. And I want to start first and foremost with some of the longest standing members of the Commission. I want to start with Congressman Greenwood and then Senator Daschle and Governor Ridge. The Commission, as you heard already, this audience has released its first national blueprint on biodefense in 2015. Why is this new one relevant today?
Thank you. When we watched the video, some of that came from a meeting that we had here in this very building when the 2015 blueprint came out. And we sat and said to the audience, which was mostly press at the time, that, as you heard, I think Joe say, it's not a question of if there's going to be a pandemic or if there's going to be a bioterror attack. It's a question of when. And I think it was clear that we talked about the impending 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu, the pandemic of 1918. And I think it was in the minds of a lot of people in public service and in the public, well, that was 100 years ago, and it's not, we haven't had something like that ever since. So they didn't take us as seriously as I think they should have. And so there wasn't a sense of urgency. And then, of course, along came the pandemic and all of the cost in human life and trillions of dollars to the economy. The outrageous thing is that we're still not ready. We're still, in all of the time that's gone by, our country is still not prepared. The public is still not protected from these kind of events, and nearly as well as they could be. And so this report, the new report that we're coming out with now, basically underscores that we're still not prepared. We haven't learned our lessons enough yet. But we've learned, as a commission, we've learned a lot since then and incorporated them into this report with, I think it's 36 recommendations and 185 specific points of what should be done by the administration, by the Congress, by the states, and the localities. We're just hoping that this time people take it seriously. And one of the things that I worry about is that in the course of the pandemic, we saw the ugly specter of partisanship showing up, and people believing that vaccines were actually dangerous, or that masks were unnecessary and so forth. And I worry that if a pandemic were to occur tomorrow, that people would go back into those camps and be resistant. So We also have to continue to educate the public that the next pandemic could be more contagious and more lethal and needs to be taken seriously by policymakers across the country.
Thank you, Congressman. Senator Daschle, please, if you want to add on to that.
Well, Raj, I think Jim said it so well. I think this document is so relevant because the stakes are so high. I don't know that anybody in this room needs to be reminded that we've lost more people to biological events than all of the wars put together. That statistic alone ought to dictate the importance of this issue. And yet we're underfunded. We spend less than the equivalent of half of an aircraft carrier on biological defense when so many of these threats are as real as you've just heard Jim describe. We have 25 different federal entities, all with some responsibility to address this challenge, and no major coordinated effort to bring it together as it needs to be to elevate this issue in terms of the governmental infrastructure so necessary. And because it's just a matter of time, we need the funding to ensure that the organizational approach that is outlined in this blueprint becomes a reality. I fear that things in public policy are out of sight and out of mind when all the other issues that are confronting Congress and the administration today, whether it's the Middle East, the Ukraine, or China, that with each one of these new international issues, this priority around biodefense falls yet another notch. We can't let it fall, and that's the whole purpose of this blueprint today.
Thank you, Senator. Governor Ridge, if you'd like to share perhaps more perspective, having been the original co-chairs with Senator Lieberman.
Well, let me say I agree with my colleagues. I wish I could have been as articulate as they were in expressing. And I think, as you pointed out at the very beginning, that this is, I think everybody on the commission thinks we need to be semper paratus. We need to always be prepared. You can't wait for the crisis to happen and try to respond to it. You're a lot better off if you can appreciate the fact that it has happened in the past, it could happen in the future, and I think as a matter of public policy, it's our responsibility to accept that reality. Not to talk about the Spanish flu, don't talk about COVID, because it did happen, and it could happen again. The source could be Mother Nature, as unpredictable as she may be, and so we've talked about that. We need to understand that. And there's so much biological research going on in labs around the world. God forbid there'd be an accidental release. The accidental release could be as fatal as a naturally occurring biologic. And then finally, God forbid, biologics are used as an instrument of warfare. Those are not unrealistic alternatives. Mother Nature, accidental release from a lab, biolab, or an adversary who has to turn to it as a last resort in conflict. That's the reality of the world we live in today. Since we know there are countries that experiment with these items, and the accidental release is not mythical. It is possible. And God forbid, the Commission says, in reality, any of those resources of a pandemic, we would be unprepared to meet. And so let us accept that reality and prepare ourselves for that possibility.
So we heard there's a need for this report now with its 36 recommendations and 185 actions because we need to be better prepared. We also have to invest more. I want to talk now about how we assess and calibrate the threat. If we're always on, if we always need to be prepared, how do we tell the difference between what's important and what's urgent and important? Mm-hmm. And so I want to turn next to Congressman Upton and then Undersecretary Weinstein, who's here in his personal capacity, having been a former commissioner before going into service. And I want to turn to Dr. Asha George, our valiant executive director, with this question. So we hear in the news about the biological threat in one form or another. Bird flu is an example of the naturally occurring outbreaks, the continued assessments being done on the origins of COVID-19 raises the specter of potential laboratory accidents or natural events. And there's also the risk of the same tools to help us create vaccines may be used, and study viruses may be used against us by adversaries to create or accelerate biological weapons. This is in the news one way or another, and sometimes it's hard to assess what's important and what's urgent and important. So I want to turn first to Congressman Upton to get your sense on what is your biggest fear? How do you calibrate this threat? What are we not prepared for in your mind?
Well, as I think about where we were, your remarks about 9/11, I was there in the Senate side that morning. No one expected that to happen. I had driven through the Pentagon parking lot that morning on my way across the 14th Street Bridge about 7:30 that morning. I lost a staffer who saw the plane hit. He never came back. COVID, 1 million Americans, more than 7 million around the world that we know of. And it was really because of a bipartisan effort that I helped lead as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee to enact 21st Century Cures, a bill that Mitch McConnell called the most significant piece of legislation enacted in a number of years. One of the elements of what it did was it expedited the approval of drugs and devices. It was the last bill that President Obama signed into law, 2016. Who would have guessed that 4 years later we needed that? And who would have guessed that in my congressional district, it was Pfizer, their largest facility in the world was in Portage in Kalamazoo, Michigan, would be the ones that would actually distribute the vaccine to produce it and be able to, when it was done, when it was ready with the FDA approval. Thanks to Peggy Hamburg, she was the FDA commissioner when we enacted 21st Century Cures. She's a member of this commission. And instead of waiting 5, 6, 7 months for it to get the approval and then the distribution, which would have been the spring of 21, maybe even late spring, we could actually send it out on the trucks that December day one, to people around the world, let alone Americans. So as I think about the threats, I was on the Hill a little bit earlier this morning talking to my two successors as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Kathy McMorris Rogers. And as we talked and we gave them a copy of this report, they have a willingness to look at it. And they know that we need help. And one of the things that this commission is providing is we are really bipartisan. We are united. Every one of, there's no disputes here. I've been on the commission about not quite a year and a half. But we're together. We've had lots of hearings. Brilliant staff, Asha. Just a brilliant staff. This report is written so well. But we're together and looking at the potential of what could be another worldwide crippling crisis. And it's pay me now or pay me later. COVID crisis cost this country $1 trillion in production and everything else. We don't want another one of these things to come. As I was on the Hill today, the front page of Politico talks about the bird flu crisis. In my home state of Michigan, we've got tens of thousands of chickens and turkeys that have been impacted in a number of different regions. We talked earlier this morning to some of the folks in Texas. They've got a cattle issue there. Our dairy is, we're relying on the Department of Agriculture and others to make sure that our food supply is safe. And we need a quarterback. We've got a lot of players on the field, but we need a quarterback that can call the play and make sure that we run together, sort of like my Michigan Wolverines. And that's what we call for here. We call for an enhanced role at the White House so that people will listen, and particularly our constituents will realize that we're not going to operate on the seat of our pants, sort of like what happened with COVID. Nobody thought that was going to happen. Thank goodness we had done some things. But now that we've done this exhaustive report in a bipartisan way, we can provide it to to the legislators to actually enact the changes that will make this country safer.
Thank you, Congressman. Governor, did I see your hand
Yeah,
raised?
just a thought to add on my
I know
colleagues.
you're an Irish man or a Penn State guy, but
We are.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we are Penn State, I
The
know that.
point I wanted to make is that as we go about this effort to help us anticipate whether it's naturally occurring or an evil source out there throws it at us, it's not necessarily unique to this country. I see it as a possibility once we develop these anecdotes or countermeasures or approaches to it. The biological threat we may feel is directed at us. Mother Nature may take it around the world as well. But if the United States of America is in a position, has done the research and developed all the countermeasures, I see it potentially as an important tool of our foreign policy. The ability to help countries help themselves in the face of this potential threat. I think that's worth it's worth our country investing because we may be able to share this information and knowledge with other parts of the world who otherwise don't have the capacity to do either. So
Good
I want to
point.
thank my colleagues for their thoughts.
The biological threat doesn't know borders. That is a point well made, Governor. Dr. George, let me come to you. What is your biggest fear? Where are we not? What are we not prepared for?
The parachute won't open. Do you know she was airborne?
So my biggest fear is that we have the State Department telling us that there are 2 offensive biological weapons programs that they're willing to say in an unclassified manner we have in this world. Russia has an offensive biological weapons program, and so does North Korea. But from a public health perspective, whenever you find a few things, we have to make some assumptions before we go off and start responding. One of those assumptions, commonly held, is that for every one thing you see, there are 6 others hanging out there. So I'm not saying today that there are 12 or 18 offensive biological weapons programs, but I think we can and should be assuming that there's way more than 2. If there are more than 2, even with just the one, things are shifting. It means that warfare is going to be different. It means what we're doing in laboratories is going to be different. I don't think we're prepared for that. I think in 1976 we got rid of our offensive biological weapons program here in the United States and then just assumed that everybody else was going to follow suit. And they didn't. Some of these countries have been very clear about that. So that's one thing I'm afraid of. The other is COVID showed us, as does every naturally occurring event that occurs, every transmission or transportation of one disease to another place, it shows us what our vulnerabilities are. We keep being shown our vulnerabilities over and over, but we don't seem to be able to fill those vulnerabilities or strengthen those vulnerabilities. Or we do, but we do it temporarily, and then stuff falls off. If you have constant vulnerabilities and you have threats out there, especially the intentional threat, I don't think we're setting ourselves up for optimal national security.
So we're hearing concern about biological weapons programs in this day and age as one major concern you're elevating. Let me come to you, Undersecretary Wainstein. I know you're here in your personal capacity, so we'll all protocols observed, as they say in government.
Ken works.
Ken, if you could speak to the same question. I mean, you have a key role in the intel community, and I would love to hear your views on this. What are we not prepared for? What keeps you up at night?
Yes, so first I want to just say thank you to my colleagues and Asha for including me in this. It was a treat to spend 7 years on this commission for all the reasons that my colleagues have laid out. Really a singular experience, but a particular honor to be here to celebrate Joe Lieberman's life. He was one of a kind, and it was a true blessing to be his colleague for all the years that I was. Look, this is really sort of going back to our conversations in 2014, 2015, when we were coming up with the original blueprint. I mean, this is a really difficult challenge, and it's sort of looking at it from my perspective, my background being in the federal government and in various capacities working sort of in the interagency process. It's just a tough nut to crack, and you know all too well, all too personally. For a couple reasons. It has like two different qualities that are worth citing. One is it being the bio threat. One is that there's no one party, no two parties, no sort of category of parties that can fix this issue. This is one of these challenges, one of these threats that requires so many different partners to work together. And sure, that's the case with any national security threat, but you can compare them. I mean, we went through post 9/11, and we went through what was really an unprecedented integration of different parts of our government, the federal government and our state and local governments, which is really the integration that I'm still working on today. But that didn't have the same multiplicity of critical players that this challenge has, which requires, teaming up of national security, the national security community, the law enforcement community, the public health community, which is a different, interesting. I'm an example of that with Asha. I think Asha at some point used the word zoonotic, and I thought if I looked in the dictionary, that would be like of or relating to a zoo. I had no idea what that meant. Because
It's close.
Yeah, it's all, there's at least an animal involved. But it requires so many parties working together, and looking just at the federal executive branch level, that's really challenging to corral them all together. Which segues to the second particular challenge of this threat, which is it's one of these out of sight, out of mind issues, because it's relatively, I say low probability. I mean, it's gonna, as we've heard, it's not if or when, but in terms of like on someone's watch, it might not happen tomorrow, but high consequence. And just, from the different seats I've been in, you've got threats that are popping up every day, whether it's terrorism attacks, domestic violent extremist attacks, you got to deal with them. Things that are happening every day, it's too easy to forget about the one that might happen, and might happen down the road. So those are the sort of two related challenges, and that requires, I think, two things. One is it requires people to step back and ring the alarm bell, and no one's done that better than this commission, making the case for how we have to address this threat, even if we don't expect it to happen today or tomorrow morning. And that's a really important service. And the second is it requires strong leadership, because, as I said, there's a tendency to look at what's happening, blowing up today, and worry about the things that might blow up tomorrow, and then that keeps receding into the future. And that requires leadership at all levels of our government to step back and say, no, this is the strategic need. Now, that was a harder argument to make when we put out the first blueprint. And then, as my colleagues have pointed out, the pandemic has made that an easier argument to make because of the devastation that it caused. But still, the government, our government at all levels, we need to show that leadership on this issue, commit the resources, commit the attention to this threat now, do the exercising, the things that you do, the building that you do before the attack happens, so that when the attack happens or the pandemic occurs, you're prepared for it. So what keeps me awake at night is that's really challenging.
Yeah.
That's not easy. I say it, it sort of sounds like, oh yeah, well, that's easy, do it. Really hard to do. And my concern is there's been progress made, in part due to this commission, but much more still needs to be made.
Well, let me say, as someone who's come from the medicine and public health community, how much I appreciated while working in office with you and learning from those working on intelligence and on homeland security. Believe me, there's a lot more words we don't understand in that community than you may not understand in the
Right.
public health community. A number of you in this first round have mentioned the COVID-19 response and the challenges we faced in responding. We know that the vaccination effort had made a lot of impact. According to a different group, the Commonwealth Fund, it showed that in the first 2 years of the vaccination campaign for COVID, that 3 million American lives were saved, $1 trillion of economic losses were averted by preventing hospitalizations. And this was all in part because of congressional action and the current administration working very hard to build on prior work from the past administration that helped bring the vaccine forward. That said, there were a lot of gaps, as have already been mentioned. I want to ask you, and we'll open this up to anyone who'd like to jump in, why, in your view, did we have challenges, and what could we do better before the next pandemic?
Roger, maybe I'll start. One of the biggest challenges I think we face, and we face it in other contexts as well, is the amount of mis and disinformation. We saw it with vaccines, we've seen it with scientific evidence, we've seen it in so many different ways, and I worry a great deal about the responsibility of government and of other sectors within society to ascertain the truth and to ensure that somehow people have the ability to benefit from the truth and from the science around the truth. I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges, and with AI in particular, there's an even greater challenge going forward. I just came back from Taiwan some time ago now, and they just had an election, and they were describing the amount of misinformation in their election generated largely by the Chinese. And it distorted the perception in many ways of many of the voters. We have to face that challenge more realistically. We faced it before. I don't think we did it as successfully as we should have. We have a lot of work to do in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, you see, just this morning we were speaking to a group in Florida. You see the constant push even around the false association between MMR, or measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and autism, which has been completely debunked in the scientific literature, that still has created a storm of misinformation that has weighed heavily on the minds of the public. And you see measles vaccine rates in schools in different parts of the country lower than they have been in many years. So your point's well taken, Senator. Other thoughts?
So
Please,
we had real issues with PPE, the stockpiles. Again, there was sort of states were up to the, as I dealt with our governor, and, I heard from colleagues, and our delegation worked well, our congressional delegation worked well, but man, you didn't know what was there, where it was, how are you going to get it delivered? Real issues there of product control and distribution, and those things ought to be ironed out. I mean, this is a perfect time to do that. Let's find out what's, and if things haven't expired, if they got changed the expiration, I mean, we ought to have a much better accounting of what's actually there and a supply chain that can work to make sure that it's replenished. When you have hospitals competing against each other instead of working with each other, and you got the patient load, I mean, we have to look at, and our hospital care workers, man, they did such a wonderful job, but they were just exhausted. We need a better system working with our community colleges and others, high schools even, to get people into that pipeline so that they can help deal with the crisis when it comes upon us, because it was, we lost a lot of people because of that.
On that point, Fred, one of the recommendations we made in the 2015 report was a fairly simple but important one, which is that each urban center should look at its hospitals and triage them. So if here in Washington, it should have been known that, okay, the first patients from a pandemic, hospital A, and there they will find pre-deployed ventilators, masks, PPE, everything that you need to meet the first group of victims. And when that hospital reaches capacity, you should go to hospital 2. It's very straightforward, but as Fred was referring to, instead we had hospitals competing against each other, we had states competing against each other, we had some political implications to what state was getting what kind of equipment first, and
You
so
had counterfeit goods that were produced.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
didn't work, that they sold it at, high
and we also have
market
to
value.
build the capacity to be prepared to create the vaccines ahead of time. There are ways in which we now have the scientific capability to develop prototypical medicines that can then be used in the event of a pandemic, so we're ahead of the game instead of what happened last time, which is we spent 2 months, Congress fighting back and forth about how much money should be spent, and starting essentially from scratch. And the science allows us to be much further down the road in the next pandemic if we're prepared to spend the money, and the money should be spent in years for not single year funding, so we shouldn't have to go to Congress and beg every year. Yeah. Congress should say, all right, we're going to do 5 years of funding at say $10 billion over 10 years, and was that the number? Good enough. Anyway, so we could forward fund this research and development and stockpiling.
Well, you're bringing up, all three of you are bringing up key aspects. I want to dig into this for a moment. Key aspects of what we need to do before a pandemic happens to be more prepared. Science is not knowledge, it's the pursuit of knowledge, so it's more susceptible to misinformation. Supply chains and pre-positioning of PPE and ventilators and triage at the beginning of a pandemic. And I remember being in Boston at the beginning of this last one, COVID-19, and seeing how challenging it was when we didn't have those things in place. And you're bringing up the need to invest in a multi-year fashion, which the current administration, of course, has called for, and this report calls for the full funding multi-year of the biodefense strategy and plan. And that Congress has a great opportunity. If we spend billions today, we can save trillions of dollars tomorrow and help avert an immeasurable number of deaths and suffering in this country. But I want to come back to something that was brought up earlier about the need for quarterbacking and even stronger White House engagement. In this report, the biodefense capabilities that President Biden bestowed upon the National Security Advisor, we've called for those to be codified in the law. That would help avert future administrations changing that and not being caught flat-footed in case of the whole biodefense space. We have an incredible bipartisan effort in the last Congress through the Prevent Pandemics Act, which people in this room had a key role in moving forward. Bipartisan legislation, in part, established a permanent White House Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy. We have Major General Paul Friedrichs, who's here with us, the inaugural director of that office, here in the audience with us. The former president had said recently in Time, and these are his words, that an office like that isn't needed, that he would close it down if reelected, and that it's giving away pork, I think was his words, that in terms of how much it costs to run it. Let me be clear, that office has requested about $6.2 million for 1 year or so, or a little around that number, prior not having any appropriations from Congress. But could you comment a bit on that? Because the codification of the National Security Advisor on biodefense complements the role of this office on pandemic preparedness and response policy. And yet, despite not just the prior administration, but even in Democratic and Republican administrations prior to that, some function like that was shifted, reduced in between these pandemics, the so-called panic and neglect cycle. How important, do you have a response to what the former president said? Because there's some people who would pay attention to that type of, and take it seriously.
Well, this commission actually spent a lot of time looking at that issue. We quizzed a number of different folks. We had internal discussions about what the role ought to be. And you need a leader, and it's the president. He's the commander-in-chief. And he or she ought to know precisely what's going on. And it seems like, and I'm one that used to work at the Office of Management Budget, so I know, how these things are supposed to be coordinated. You don't want agencies without a game plan that are out there. And if it comes from the White House or OMB, you got a baseball bat. And you're actually able to get things done, and people will listen. And we require, or we asked in this, that they actually give a report, a quadrennial report to the Congress in terms of the weaknesses and successes and where they ought to go. And that role ought to be strengthened. And when you think that you have people, I'll just say from the left and the right, people on this commission, Republicans and Democrats, who are absolutely unified on this issue, it seems to me that that is the best no-brainer of what this report, what our recommendations call for, to be prepared for the future, to actually have a quarterback instead of, what they've had done before. But we would be much better off with a stronger role, directly, in essence, having the agencies respond to someone that that they're going to listen to.
So we said this report has 185 recommendations of things that we should do. If we put out a report that said 185 things we should absolutely not do, I think getting rid of that office would be number one.
Well said. And I'm a basketball player, so I'd be terrible on a football
We've done
field.
baseball and football. So
I'd be terrible at both.
This ought to be a free throw.
Yeah, there you go.
go.
But in any of these sports, the captains or the quarterbacks need a uniform, they need equipment, they need a playing field to organize their team on and move towards the goal line. So my point here is the resources need to come with that, and that's why it's critical. I mean, it's just north of $6 million. Doesn't sound like giving pork to me. It sounds like a great return on investment given how much we could save. So appreciate your comments on that. Governor Ridge, did you want to come in?
If I might add, it shows you how the process works within the commission. Initially, I think there was general agreement that we needed someone in the White House to oversee all this and to be able to push the buttons and have control of oversight. I initially advocated for the vice president, and because my experience had been when we built Homeland Security, the vice president had been very helpful when I had some suggestions. I could get him and his team, and if there was any differences, you could be the arbiter. And I was reminded at that time, my colleagues didn't agree with me. So we said, we all agreed that there ought to be a central place, a central focus within the White House. That's how we ended up with the solution, the compromise that we did. You said the compromise is oxygen of democracy. A very good compromise. I'm reminded, was it Yul Brynner and the King and I, who once said, so let it be written, so let it be done. So if you're in the White House, trust me, if somebody picks up the phone and says, so let it be written, you're going to be doing it. And I think we ended up at the right place.
Let me. We have about 8 or 9 more minutes left here. So, with you all have highlighted throughout this entire afternoon the importance of bipartisan leadership. Are there several of you who've served on the Hill at various points, from Governor Ridge, who previously served in the House, Senator Daschle, of course, Congressman Upton and Greenwood. Are there leaders on the Hill now that give you hope for bipartisan action on biodefense?
They have no choice. And earlier this morning I went up and spent some time with Frank Pallone and Kathy McMorris Rogers, CMR. I know the Senate's going to be interested in this as well. We have a lot of connections, and frankly, we've done a lot of their work for them. That's what they enlisted us to do. I mean, we went through a lot of hearings. They were all public. They were all transparent. I mean, we did reports. We did Q&A. A lot of effort, particularly since the last report came out nearly 10 years ago. But yeah, there is. Now, this Congress, let's face it, pretty dysfunctional, right? I don't know anyone that's got a different view on that, not many anyway. This is an opportunity now to put things back together with a toolbox. We're providing the tools to move forward. So I'd like to think, and even though this Congress is coming to an end here soon, not a lot is expected between now and the end of the year, this sets the stage for really what they need to do, not only to set the stage this year for the conclusion, maybe working with the reauthorization of PAPA, although that's got some issues, I know, between the House and the Senate. But at some point it's going to happen, and this is getting to first base for them. and provides a blueprint. And you know, we had a positive discussion today. We're going to do follow-up. The information is going to be flowing. So I think at the end of the day, as an optimist, yeah, we're going to get a lot of this thing done.
Raj, I would just say I agree completely with Fred. In spite of all the dysfunction we've continued to witness in this Congress, I look back at the COVID response and how overwhelmingly bipartisan the COVID response was. And I think as I talk to members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, both House and Senate, I find that there is still a good deal of broad bipartisan support. What I think we lack are bipartisan champions. That is somebody who elevates it beyond just support to active engagement and leadership. We need more champions. We need people that aren't just prepared to say, yes, I'll support something. They're going to roll up their sleeves. They're going to provide some leadership, some ideas, take these recommendations and turn them into legislation and ultimately make that legislation law. But it takes champions to do that on both sides of the aisle.
And Susan Brooks, who's a member of this commission but not able to be here today, she was a leader on PAPA. She moved it through the Energy and Commerce Committee. She worked that bipartisan issue, and you got Diana DeGette and you got others. So I mean, it is really both sides of the aisle that can come together on this. So there's going to be a sweet spot here where it's going to happen.
Yeah, what an opportunity to build on your point about champions, to be part, to shape a legacy that's about, I mean, how many more lives could you really save? I mean, what action in Congress could save as many lives as than taking more action on these set of issues? So I appreciate those comments. We're right at about time. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to actually pose this to each of you. You know, the author Nassim Taleb wrote about the concept of anti-fragility. The idea that when we face adversity, we can get weaker, we can recover to where we were, or if we embrace anti-fragility, through adversity, we can actually become stronger. At its core, the actions in this report are about trying to help ensure we're stronger through this adversity that we've faced and that we will continue to face when it comes to the biological threat. So I'm going to ask a magic wand question. There are 36 recommendations, 185 actions. There's also, by the way, if you were checking, 80 acronyms in the report as well, from AI to WMD. We've covered the entire gamut. But if there was one action, and you could wave a magic wand and it would happen, what action would that be in the space of biodefense? We'll start with you, Dr. George. You know how much I love putting you on the spot.
That's no problem. I would say, magic wand, that Congress needs to establish a congressional agenda for biodefense so that you don't have a bazillion committees and a bazillion other subcommittees randomly deciding to have hearings when something happens or when there's some other forcing function. Something where everybody is unified. And, you know, I used to work on the Hill. People will say, oh, you know, it's impossible. It's not impossible. We did it with 9/11. We did it with the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. We have done it with other things in the past. It's just a question of whether Congress can prioritize and place value on something like this in advance before something happens, again, or another thing happens. But that would be my magic wand.
Thank you. Ken?
Sure. Look, I'll pivot off of what Asha said about coming out of adversity stronger. I think you take a look at 9/11 and you see that we did come out stronger. And it really was sort of marshaling all the forces of our government and our society to build an infrastructure that, you know, has been fairly successful in preventing large-scale terrorism attacks since 9/11. And so we came out stronger, and we learned how to do it. and you hear at different times for different threats, let's use that blueprint. So cyber came into its own as a national security threat. It was, okay, let's use the post 9/11 blueprint. And we need to hear more of that as it relates to this threat. And recognize that out of the pandemic that we all suffered through a few years ago, we can and should build a stronger apparatus and a stronger social and government effort to prevent it from happening again. And that would be my magic wand hope.
So I might think about the indoor issue, being able to transform buildings, schools, places of business, airplanes, mass transit, so that we prevent as much as we can the contagiousness of a pathogen. And it also occurs to me that if we could do that fairly, and it would take a magic wand, but if we could do that fairly successfully, we might get away from some of this infighting about should I wear a mask, should I not wear a mask, should I go to school, should the businesses be closed and so forth, because we would already have protections built into our infrastructure.
I don't know that you can really narrow it down to one. I mean, I will say, and I know Jim would agree with me, and I know Susan Brooks, who's not here, would agree with me, that if you just give it to the Energy and Commerce Committee, we'll take care of it. But I would, you know, there's so many good things here. I mean, the early warning system, the BioWatch is not working. We're wasting a bunch of money on that. It's really sad. And, you know, that needs to be replaced. And I think it's a good idea. One of the things we talked about earlier this morning is really using our national labs. So it's just, you know, they're gold mines for us in terms of science and research and so many different things that they do. And it would be good to really enlist their aid to see a replacement so that we have a warning system. So we know something's going to happen, that we can react to it much more quickly than what is today. If you remember when COVID started, I remember having lunch with a guy, and he was telling me about his son who was in Wuhan and the lockdowns that they were having for weeks. And just unbelievable stories. And then, of course, the rest of the world learned about it, you know, a month or two later. So by having that early warning system and being prepared, following through with some of these other recommendations, we're going to be much better off. And at the end, we all know people that died. I had staff people who lost family members. We all have close friends. We don't want to go through that again. So we can do better. And that's what this does.
Raj, I would say that just kind of in some ways reiterating some of the things that have already been said, I would like to see a governmental infrastructure in both the executive and legislative branches that accommodates making biosecurity a national priority. I think it starts with infrastructure, because with that infrastructure you get the funding, you get the decision-making apparatus, you get the prioritization that's so critical. But it would seem to me that it starts with that, creating an infrastructure that accommodates prioritization, and that's so critical. I'm going to take a minute. Governor Ridge and I were just commenting a minute ago that no one really knows how much work goes into what you're holding, some of you are holding in your hands. This is an enormous, enormous amount of work, the product of hours and days and weeks and months of time and effort on the part of staff in particular. And so we just want to take a minute just to thank our staff and our ex officio members for all of the work that they did in ensuring the success of this effort. It's really remarkable.
As they often say on the floor of both the House and the Senate, I'd like to associate my remarks with senators. Your notion about the infrastructure, I really think to get the catalyst to get things moving is create the infrastructure in the White House, from which the budget will drive that, the power of persuasion exists there, and I think Congress would be more inclined to build an infrastructure to respond to what the White House was establishing. That's a great idea.
Tom, when I was at OMB, we had a saying, it's not the policy that drives the budget, it's the budget that drives the policy. So that's where it's got to start to really
Good.
have it happen.
Well, those are fitting words to close on. I also want to acknowledge a few members of the staff. If you would just stand up for a moment so we can
Amen.
recognize
Yeah.
your efforts and spirit of what Governor Ridge and
Thank you, Tom. Perfect.
Well, I think we'll close here, or as we say in, I've never said it, but the session is adjourned. Is that how you would
Yield
say
back the
it?
balance of your
It's
time.
not a
This session is adjourned. We, of course, have Dr. George is going to come up soon after this next video. But thank you, and let me also thank each of you for your consistency, because I think consistency is one of the most underrated aspects of leadership. And this, if anything, especially in between emergencies and events, whether it's between anthrax and the next bioterror event or between COVID and the next pandemic, requires consistent leadership over decades, not just years. So thank all of you, and for many in the audience who've also been consistently focused on this mission.
Biodefense is so important in part because it's a weapon of mass destruction that we minimize. Bioweapons can be natural, they can be man-made, they can be accidental. They can come from all kinds of sources and can have every bit as much of a consequence as a nuclear weapon has.
Viruses are smarter than us. They will develop in directions that we may or may not predict. We may or may not be able to know ahead of time which one is coming, but when they do come, they impact everyone equally.
Biodefense is the defense against infectious diseases from naturally occurring causes, from accidental releases like from laboratories or facilities, and from biological attacks.
When you have so many agencies and so many different offices responsible for biodefense issues, where does the leadership come from? You have to have someone in charge.
Viruses don't pay attention to political ideology. Risk, like pandemics and biological threats, requires that same kind of bipartisan leadership.
I've seen the commission working in both Democratic and Republican administrations with both Democratic and Republican Congresses.
We operate by consensus. The job of our commission is to anticipate the future.
Unfortunately, due to modern science, the nature of the threat is expanding at least as fast as our ability to counter it.
COVID was the most severe wake-up call anyone could possibly experience. We're going to experience it again. The real question is, are we going to be ready? And the answer today is we are not.
The way in which the flu epidemic dislocated millions of people around the world, it could happen again. We're traveling much more than people did in 1918, but we also have the capacity to develop countermeasures much better than they did at that time, and shame on us if we don't.
The National Blueprint for Biodefense that we are releasing this year has in it 36 recommendations that go across all the different agencies and Congress.
We've educated our colleagues in Congress about what the blueprint was. The new blueprint is going to really dig in even more as to what the White House, Congress, and all the different agencies need to do.
Governor Ridge always talks about public service as being something that you can do from in the government or outside the government.
Well, I'm always hopeful. I wouldn't have been on this commission for 10 years if I didn't think that we would continue to make progress.
I believe that people are starting to listen. This commission has made the point that there's an urgency in every level of government, in every healthcare institution, to be organized and to be ready.
Well, thanks, everybody. I'm going to say what you're all thinking, which is I'm the last person standing between you and a drink, so I won't take too long. But I do want to say, give a note of thanks to all of you for coming today, and as Raj said, for being consistent. Every person in this room has had something to do with biodefense and probably something to do with this commission, and we really appreciate it. I want to thank Hudson Institute, which serves as our fiscal sponsor. I want to thank the First Lady of Pennsylvania for coming today, Mrs. Ridge, and Mrs. Parker. and all the family and friends, all of our family and friends and colleagues. Senator Lieberman's loss was felt by all of us. It was a shock, and it was a heartbreak. It really was. But I can tell you that all the commissioners said the last thing that Joe would want us to do is weep and waste time weeping. So shed a tear and get on with it, because we have work to do. He would also say that it's incredibly important. What we do, all of us, whether it's inside biodefense or related to biodefense, what we do is important. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that there is still work to be done. We have to do it. We have to continue to do it. He would say, the reason we have to do it is not just because it's bad for the country. It's because we are the country. We are America. It is our responsibility to stay in the fight, to continue to do what we need to do. There are lots of people associated with this commission that have been part of this commission. One of those people was Dr. Yona Alexander, who also passed away recently. He was not just a national expert in terrorism and counterterrorism. He was a global expert in terrorism and counterterrorism. His loss is felt here in the United States and across the world. NATO is mourning right now. They're closing up his office, as is the EU. We have been incredibly fortunate to have been able to work with these fine men and women who are our commissioners, who are our ex officios, and who are part of our staff. I want to thank Vernell Glover, the Senator Lieberman's executive assistant, underlining executive. We could not have done 99% of the work that we have gotten done without her able assistance and that of the assistance of our commissioners and ex officios as well. I would just like to leave you with just one other thought, and that is the senator was very clear about the challenges and how difficult it is to hang in and stay in the fight. He once said to me to take courage, Asha dear, take courage. We can prevail, and we will prevail. So let's start by prevailing outside with our reception. Thank you very much again. We really appreciate the support, and I want to see you here again the next time we redo the blueprint. And maybe at that point, we'll only have one recommendation or 0 recommendations. Hopefully we'll all get it done. Thanks.